Thunder rolled across the distant mountains as Grace Dawson clutched her shawl tightly around her shoulders, her 7-month pregnant belly prominent beneath the worn fabric. She stood frozen at the bottom of the church steps in Willow Creek, Wyoming Territory, 1876, as whispers sliced through the Sunday morning air like knives. The stares of the townsfolk burned into her back while Pastor Fleming blocked the entrance, his bony finger pointing accusingly at her swollen middle. "We don't welcome your kind here, Miss Dawson," he declared loudly enough for everyone in the gathering crowd to hear. "A woman in your condition, unmarried and unrepentant, is not fit to worship among decent folk." Grace's cheeks flushed hot with shame. 6 months in this new town, trying to build a life after fleeing eastward, and now this public humiliation. She'd known coming to church was a risk, but she'd hoped for compassion or at least anonymity in the back pew. Instead, she found herself the center of a spectacle. "Please," she whispered, voice barely audible over the disapproving murmurs. "I just want to pray." "Prayer is for the virtuous," the pastor replied coldly. "Not for fallen women." Grace's vision blurred with tears. Her hands trembled as they protectively covered her unborn child. The whispers grew louder. Someone in the crowd laughed. "Well now, that ain't very Christian-like behavior, is it, Pastor?" The deep voice cut through the murmurs like a blade. The crowd parted as a tall figure approached from the hitching posts. Rusty Daniels, his auburn hair catching the morning sunlight as he removed his worn Stetson, walked deliberately toward the confrontation. His spurs jangled with each step, the only sound in the suddenly silent churchyard. Rusty wasn't a regular churchgoer. Most knew him as the quiet, hard-working rancher who kept mostly to himself at the Double R Ranch outside town. His weathered face was stern as he approached, stopping just beside Grace. "Madam," he said, nodding respectfully to her before turning back to the pastor. "Seems to me the good book says something about judge not lest ye be judged, or did I misread that part?" Pastor Fleming's face reddened. "Mr. Daniels, this is church business." "Is that so?" Rusty's voice remained calm, but his eyes hardened. "Last I checked, the Lord's house was open to all who seek him." He turned to Grace, who was still fighting back tears. "Madam, would you allow me the honor of escorting you inside?" Grace looked up at him, stunned by this unexpected intervention. She'd seen Rusty Daniels around town but had never spoken to him. Now, in her moment of greatest humiliation, this stranger was offering his arm. Yes, thank you," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. Rusty offered his arm, and after a moment's hesitation, Grace placed her trembling hand upon it. He covered her hand with his own weathered one, steadying her. "Pastor," Rusty said, his voice carrying across the churchyard, "I believe we'll be joining the service now, if that's all right with you." It wasn't really a question. The challenge in his eyes was clear to everyone watching. After a tense moment, the pastor stepped aside, his mouth a thin line of disapproval. "This isn't proper," someone in the crowd muttered. "Proper?" Rusty turned, scanning the faces of the townsfolk. "What's proper is showing kindness to those in need. Anything less ain't worthy of calling itself Christian." He nodded toward the church door. "Shall we, Miss Dawson?" With her head held as high as she could manage, Grace walked beside Rusty up the church steps. She could feel every eye upon them, could hear the whispers starting again, but with Rusty's arm solid beneath her hand, she found the strength to keep moving forward. As they entered the cool dimness of the church interior, Grace whispered, "Why would you do that for me? You don't even know me." Rusty guided her to an empty pew near the back. "My ma taught me that real strength is standing up for those who need it most. Besides," he added with a small smile as they sat down, "seems to me you've got enough to carry without adding their judgment to your load." For the first time in months, Grace felt something other than fear and shame. It wasn't quite hope, not yet, but as the organ began to play and the congregation reluctantly filed in, giving them a wide berth, she felt the smallest spark of something that might one day grow into it. The service passed in a blur for Grace. She was acutely aware of Rusty's presence beside her, his broad shoulders and the faint scent of leather and open prairie. When it came time for communion, he remained seated beside her when she didn't rise, though she noticed how his jaw tightened when Pastor Fleming pointedly skipped their pew. As the final hymn concluded and people began to file out, Grace tensed, dreading the gauntlet they would have to walk. Would you like to wait until they've gone? Rusty asked quietly. Grace took a deep breath. No, I can't hide forever, Rusty nodded, a glimmer of respect in his eyes. Then we'll walk out together head high, and they did. The whispers followed them, but Rusty's steady presence beside her made them somehow easier to bear. Outside on the church steps, several women deliberately pulled their children away as Grace approached. One man spat in the dirt near her feet. Rusty's hand tightened slightly around hers on his arm, but he didn't rise to the bait. Instead, he led her down the steps and toward the dusty street. Where's your home, Miss Dawson? I'll see you safely there. The milliner's shop on Oak Street. I have a room above it. She hesitated. Mr. Daniels, I can't thank you enough, but you've done more than enough. I don't want to cause you any more trouble. Rusty's expression softened. It's no trouble, Miss Dawson. Grace, she said impulsively. Please call me Grace. Grace, he repeated, tipping his hat. I'm Rusty. And if you don't mind, I'd still like to see you to your door. As they walked through town, Grace felt the stares of passers-by. News traveled fast in Willow Creek. They'll talk about you now, she said softly. Associating with me, it won't do your reputation any favors. Rusty gave a short laugh. Don't much care for reputations built on cruelty, Miss Grace. Never have. When they reached the milliner's shop, Grace paused at the side entrance that led to her upstairs room. Would you like to come up for some coffee? It's the least I can do to thank you. Rusty studied her for a moment, then shook his head gently. Thank you, but I've got to head back to the ranch. Cattle don't feed themselves on Sundays. He hesitated. But I would be honored if you'd allow me to call on you properly sometime. Grace blinked in surprise. You want to call on me? After? She gestured vaguely at her swollen belly. I'd like to get to know you better if you're willing, he said simply. Perhaps I could come by tomorrow evening. Grace found herself nodding before she'd fully processed his request. Yes, that would be nice. Rusty smiled then, a genuine smile that transformed his weathered face. Until tomorrow, then. He tipped his hat once more and turned to leave. Rusty, Grace called after him. When he turned back, she said softly, Thank you, not just for walking with me, but for seeing me, really seeing me. Something flickered in his eyes, understanding, perhaps, or recognition of something familiar. Everyone deserves that much, Grace. Everyone. As she climbed the stairs to her small room, Grace felt lighter than she had in months, despite the weight she carried. For the first time since arriving in Willow Creek, she felt as though she might have found a friend. The next day dawned bright and clear. Grace woke early, as was her habit, and prepared for her day at the milliner's shop below. Mrs. Holloway, the shop's owner, was one of the few people in town who had shown Grace kindness, offering her both work and lodging when no one else would. Heard about what happened at church yesterday, Mrs. Holloway said as Grace entered the shop. The older woman's hands remained busy with the hat she was trimming, but her eyes were sharp behind her spectacles. That Pastor Fleming always did have more judgment than compassion. Grace busied herself arranging ribbons. It was difficult, and Rusty Daniels stepped in, did he? Mrs. Holloway nodded approvingly. Good man, Rusty, keeps to himself mostly, but fair and decent. His ranch is doing well from what I hear. You know him? Grace asked, trying to sound casual. Mrs. Holloway smiled knowingly. Willow Creek isn't that big, dear. Everyone knows everyone, more or less. Rusty's been here about 5 years now, came from somewhere back east, built that ranch up from nearly nothing. She paused her work. He's coming to call on you this evening, Grace blushed. News does travel fast. Small towns, Mrs. Holloway said with a shrug. For what it's worth, I think it's a good match. He's a bit older than you, but a steady man, and Lord knows you could use someone steady in your life right now. Throughout the day, Grace found her thoughts returning to Rusty, his quiet strength, the gentle way he'd offered his arm, the respect in his eyes when he looked at her. No man had looked at her that way since. Well, since before. As evening approached, Grace grew increasingly nervous. She changed into her best dress, one she'd altered herself to accommodate her changing body, and pinned her hair up carefully. The face that looked back at her from the small mirror seemed both familiar and strange. Her cheeks had more color than usual, and her eyes seemed brighter. When the knock came at her door promptly at 7, Grace took a deep breath before opening it. Rusty stood there, hat in hand, wearing a clean shirt and vest. His hair was damp, as if freshly washed, and he'd trimmed his beard. In his free hand, he held a small bunch of wildflowers. "Evening, Miss Grace," he said, suddenly looking uncertain. "I hope I'm not too early." "Not at all," she replied, stepping back to let him in. "Please come in." Her room was small but tidy, a bed in one corner, a small table with two chairs, a trunk containing her few belongings, and a tiny stove for cooking and warmth. She'd done her best to make it homey, with a colorful quilt on the bed and curtains she'd sewn herself. "These are for you," Rusty said, holding out the wildflowers. "Not much, I'm afraid, but they were growing near the creek and made me think of you." Grace took them, touched by the simple gesture. "They're beautiful, thank you." She found a jar to use as a vase and arranged them on the table. "Please sit down. Would you like some coffee?" "That would be nice, thank you." As Grace busied herself with the coffee pot, an awkward silence fell between them. There were so many questions hanging in the air, so many things unsaid. Finally, Rusty spoke. "I want to apologize if I overstepped yesterday. I couldn't just stand by, but I hope I didn't make things worse for you." Grace turned to face him. "No, don't apologize. What you did. No one stood up for me like that in a long time." She rested her hand on her belly. "Most people see this and make up their minds about me without knowing anything." Rusty's gaze was steady. "I'm not most people." "No," she agreed softly, "you're not." She brought the coffee to the table and sat across from him. For a moment they sipped in silence. "How long have you been in Willow Creek?" Rusty asked. 6 months. I came west from Boston after." She hesitated, then decided on honesty. "After I found myself in this condition, my parents made it clear I wasn't welcome at home anymore." Rusty's expression darkened. "That couldn't have been easy." "It wasn't, but Mrs. Holloway took me in, gave me work. She's been kind." Grace looked down at her coffee cup. "The baby's father, he made promises he never intended to keep. When I told him, he denied everything, said I was trying to trap him." The bitterness in her voice surprised even her. "Some men aren't worthy of the title," Rusty said quietly. Grace looked up at him. "What about you? Have you always been in Willow Creek?" Rusty shook his head. "No, I came out here about 5 years ago from Pennsylvania. Wanted to make my own way, build something that was mine." He took a sip of coffee. "Always loved horses and open spaces. The ranch isn't much compared to some, but it's mine. Built it up from 20 acres to nearly 200 now." "That's impressive," Grace said, genuinely admirative. "It's a good life, lonely sometimes, but good." His eyes met hers. "I've been watching you around town, you know, not in a troublesome way," he added quickly. "Just noticed how you carry yourself, pride but kindness too. You help Mrs. Wilson with her groceries every Tuesday. You gave your lunch to that Miller boy when his family couldn't afford food last month." Grace stared at him, astonished that he'd noticed these small kindnesses. "You've been paying attention." "I notice things," he said simply. "And what I've seen tells me more about your character than any rumors or circumstances." They talked for hours, the coffee growing cold as they shared stories from their lives. Rusty told her about growing up with 4 sisters, about his dreams for his ranch, about the new foal born just last week. Grace shared memories of Boston, her love of reading, her hope to one day open a small dressmaking shop of her own. As the evening wore on, Grace felt something unfamiliar blossoming in her chest, a feeling of being truly seen and heard, of being valued for who she was rather than judged for her mistakes. When the clock struck 10, Rusty reluctantly rose to leave. "I've kept you up too late. You need your rest." "I've enjoyed every minute," Grace said truthfully. At the door, Rusty paused. "Grace, I'd like to see you again, if you're willing," she smiled. "I'd like that very much. Sunday after church, perhaps. We could have a picnic by the creek if you feel up to it." The mention of church made Grace's smile falter. "After yesterday, I'm not sure." Rusty's expression grew determined. "If you want to go to church, Grace, I'll be right beside you. If you don't, that's fine too. But don't let them chase you away from your faith if it matters to you." His understanding touched her deeply. "A picnic sounds lovely whether we attend church or not." Rusty nodded, satisfied. "Then it's settled." He hesitated, then reached out and gently took her hand. "Thank you for this evening, Grace. It's been a long time since I've enjoyed someone's company this much." As he walked down the stairs, Grace leaned against the doorframe, watching until he disappeared from view. Something had changed tonight, something important. For the first time since discovering her pregnancy, she felt not just resignation about her future, but a flicker of genuine hope. Over the next few weeks, Rusty became a regular visitor at Grace's small room above the milliner's shop. Sometimes he brought simple gifts, fresh eggs from his chickens, a book he thought she might enjoy, wildflowers gathered from the prairie. Other times, he came with nothing but stories and his attentive presence. On Sundays, true to his word, he escorted her to church. The first few times were difficult, the whispers continued, and Pastor Fleming's sermons often seemed pointedly directed at moral failings and the wages of sin. But with Rusty beside her, Grace found strength to hold her head high. Gradually, some of the townsfolk began to soften. Mrs. Wilson, whose groceries Grace often helped with, made a point of greeting her warmly. Mr. Peterson, the bookseller, saved a copy of a new novel he thought she might enjoy. Small kindnesses, but they meant the world to Grace. One evening in late May, nearly a month after their first meeting, Rusty arrived looking unusually serious. "Is everything all right?" Grace asked as she let him in. "Yes, just been thinking." He removed his hat, turning it in his hands, a nervous gesture she'd come to recognize. "Grace, I have something to ask you, and I want you to know you can say no without any fear of offending me." Grace's heart quickened. "What is it?" "I've been fixing up the old foreman's cabin on my property. It's small but solid, 2 rooms and a good roof." He met her eyes directly. "I'd like to offer it to you and your baby when the time comes, as a place to stay, no strings attached, no expectations, just a safe place for you both." Grace stared at him, shocked by the offer. "Rusty, That's incredibly generous, but I couldn't possibly—" "You could pay rent if it makes you feel better," he said quickly. "Or help with the ranch books. I've seen your handwriting, and Lord knows my ledgers could use a woman's touch." He stepped closer. "The truth is, Grace, I worry about you. This room is fine for now, but with a baby and the talk in town—" "The talk will only get worse if I move to your ranch," Grace pointed out softly. Rusty's jaw tightened. "Let them talk. I don't care what anyone thinks, and neither should you. All that matters is what's best for you and your child." Grace felt tears welling up. His kindness overwhelmed her. "Why are you doing this? Why do you care so much about what happens to me?" Rusty set his hat down and gently took her hands in his. "Because in the short time I've known you, Grace Dawson, you've awakened something in me I thought was long dead. Because you're brave and kind and deserve far better than what life has handed you. Because—" He took a deep breath. "Because I'm falling in love with you." The words hung in the air between them. Grace's heart pounded so loudly she was sure he must hear it. "Rusty," she whispered, "you can't mean that. I'm carrying another man's child. I'm ruined in the eyes of society. I have nothing to offer you." "You're not ruined," he said fiercely. "You're the strongest woman I've ever met, and that child—" he nodded toward her belly. "That child is innocent and deserving of love. I'm not offering out of pity, Grace. I'm offering because I see a future with you in it if you'll have me." Grace searched his face, looking for any sign of hesitation or uncertainty. She found none, only earnest hope and something deeper, warmer. "I don't know what to say," she admitted. "You don't have to say anything now," Rusty assured her. "The offer stands regardless. Think about it. The cabin is yours whether or not you—" He hesitated, then pressed on. "Whether or not you return my feelings, I just want you safe." Grace felt something shift inside her, not the baby moving, but something in her heart. This man who had walked into her life so unexpectedly was offering her not just shelter but respect, care, and now, incredibly, love. "I need time," she said finally. "Not because I don't care for you, I do, more than I thought possible, but because I need to be sure, for both our sakes." Rusty nodded, relief evident in his expression. "That's fair, all the time you need." He squeezed her hands gently. "Just know that my feelings won't change. They've only grown stronger each day I've known you." That night after Rusty left, Grace sat by her window for a long time, watching the stars and considering his offer. The practical benefits were clear: a safer, more suitable home for her child, away from the judgmental eyes of the town. But there was more to consider. Her feelings for Rusty had grown with each meeting, blossoming from gratitude into genuine affection and now something deeper. Could she trust those feelings, after being so badly hurt before, and what of Rusty himself? Was it fair to accept his offer, knowing he might one day regret taking on another man's child? Yet the look in his eyes when he'd spoken of the baby had contained no resentment, only tenderness. Grace rested her hands on her swollen belly, feeling the baby move beneath her palms. "What do you think, little one?" she whispered. "Should we trust him?" As if in answer, the baby kicked strongly directly against her hand. Grace couldn't help but laugh softly. "Is that a yes? You haven't even met him yet." But she had met him. And in the past month, she'd seen Rusty Daniels's character revealed in 100 small ways: his gentleness with the stray dog that hung around the general store, his patience with old Mr. Jenkins's endless stories, the respect with which he treated everyone from the bank president to the Chinese laundry worker. He was a good man, perhaps the best man she'd ever known. The next Sunday after church, they went for their usual walk along Willow Creek. The late spring day was perfect warm sunshine, a gentle breeze carrying the scent of wildflowers, the sound of the creek bubbling over stones. Grace had been unusually quiet, deep in thought, and Rusty had respected her silence, simply walking beside her, occasionally pointing out a bird or interesting plant. When they reached a small clearing with a fallen log beside the water, Rusty suggested they rest. Grace was grateful. At 8 months pregnant, walking had become increasingly tiring. As they sat watching the water flow past, Grace took a deep breath. "I've been thinking about your offer." Rusty turned to her, his expression carefully neutral, "and I'd like to accept both parts of it." She met his gaze steadily. "The cabin for me and the baby, and your love if you're still offering it." The smile that broke across Rusty's face was like the sun emerging from behind clouds. "Both are yours, Grace, for as long as you want them." He took her hand gently. "I know it's too soon to speak of marriage, with the baby coming so soon and us still getting to know each other. But I want you to know that's where my heart is headed, if you'll have me someday." Grace felt tears of happiness spilling down her cheeks. "I never thought I'd find someone who could look past my situation, who could see me." "I see you," Rusty said simply. "I've seen you from the first moment outside that church, and I'll keep seeing you, Grace Dawson, for as long as you'll let me." He leaned forward slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished. Instead, Grace closed the distance between them, pressing her lips to his in a soft, sweet kiss that held both promise and gratitude. When they parted, Rusty rested his forehead against hers. "When would you like to see the cabin? Today?" Grace suggested, suddenly eager to see this place that might become her home, their home eventually. "If it's not too much trouble." "No trouble at all." He helped her to her feet. "My buggy's in town. We can go right now if you're feeling up to it." The ride to the Double R Ranch took about 40 minutes, following the creek upstream into increasingly beautiful country. As they crested a small hill, the ranch spread out before them, a modest but well-maintained main house, a large barn, corrals with several horses, and pastureland stretching to distant hills. "It's beautiful," Grace breathed, taking in the peaceful scene. Rusty's expression was proud. "It's taken a lot of work, but it's coming along." He pointed to a small cabin set apart from the main house, near a stand of cottonwood trees. "That's the foreman's cabin. When I first bought the place, I lived there while fixing up the main house. Been using it for storage mostly, but I've been working on making it habitable again." He guided the buggy to the cabin and helped Grace down. The exterior was simple but charming, weathered wood with a small, covered porch. A window box had been recently added, though it was currently empty. "Thought you might want to plant some flowers," Rusty explained, noticing her gaze. "Make it your own." Inside, the cabin was larger than Grace had expected. The main room served as both kitchen and living area, with a solid table, 2 chairs, a comfortable-looking rocking chair near the stone fireplace, and shelves along one wall. Everything was spotlessly clean, the wood floor recently swept. "The bedroom's through here," Rusty said, leading her to the second room. It contained a bed with a fresh mattress, a small dresser, and a handmade cradle in the corner. Grace's breath caught at the sight of the cradle. She moved toward it slowly, running her fingers along the smooth wood. "I made it," Rusty said quietly. "Been working on it evenings." "If you don't like it, it's perfect," Grace whispered, tears filling her eyes again. The cradle was beautifully crafted, with delicate carving along the sides and rockers that would allow it to sway gently. "You made this for my baby." "For our baby," Rusty corrected gently. "If you'll let me think of the little one that way." Grace turned to him, overcome with emotion. "You would do that? Take another man's child as your own?" Rusty's expression was serious. "Grace, where I come from, being a father isn't about whose blood runs in a child's veins. It's about who teaches them, protects them, loves them. I'd be honored to be that for your child if you'll have me. Grace couldn't hold back any longer. She moved into his arms, burying her face against his chest as he held her close, his hand gently stroking her hair. Is that a yes? He asked softly. She nodded against his chest. Yes, 1,000 times yes. 3 weeks later, Grace moved into the cabin. Mrs. Holloway had been sad to see her go, but understood Grace's decision. You deserve happiness, my dear, the older woman had said. And that man looks at you like you hung the moon. Life at the ranch quickly fell into a pleasant rhythm. Grace kept her job at the milliner's, with Rusty driving her to town 3 days a week. The other days, she made the cabin truly her own, planting the window boxes with cheerful marigolds and petunias, organizing the kitchen to her liking, and beginning to sew baby clothes in the evenings. Rusty was true to his word about not rushing her. He kept his residence in the main house, visiting Grace for meals and companionship, but always returning to his own bed. The arrangement raised eyebrows among some of the ranch hands, but Rusty's firm leadership and obvious respect for Grace soon quieted any gossip. As her due date approached, Grace found herself increasingly grateful for the peace of the ranch. Here, away from the judgmental eyes of the town, she could enjoy the final weeks of her pregnancy without constant whispers and stares. Rusty proved to be an attentive companion, bringing her books to read, making sure she rested adequately, and even massaging her swollen feet in the evenings as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. Their conversations ranged from childhood memories to dreams for the future, deepening their connection with each passing day. One evening in late June, as they sat watching fireflies dance near the creek, Grace felt the first contraction. She gasped, clutching her belly. Grace. Rusty was immediately alert. Is it time? She nodded, suddenly nervous. I think so, but it's early yet. First babies often take their time. Nevertheless, Rusty sprang into action. He helped her back to the cabin, made her comfortable on the bed, and sent one of the ranch hands to fetch the midwife from town. While they waited, he held her hand through each contraction, his steady presence calming her fears. Mrs. Benson, the midwife, arrived just as Grace's labor intensified. She shooed Rusty from the bedroom with instructions to boil water and prepare clean linens. Never seen a man so concerned, she commented as she examined Grace. Most fathers pace outside or head to the saloon. He's not the father, Grace said, then corrected herself. Not by blood anyway, but in all the ways that matter. Mrs. Benson nodded understandingly. Love makes families in all sorts of ways, dear. Now let's focus on bringing this little one into the world. The labor was long and difficult. Through the night and into the following day, Grace fought through waves of pain, drawing strength from Rusty's presence whenever Mrs. Benson allowed him in the room. By mid-afternoon, she was exhausted, feeling she couldn't continue. I can't do this, she sobbed during a particularly intense contraction. Rusty, who had slipped back in during Mrs. Benson's brief absence, took her hand firmly. Yes, you can, Grace Dawson. You're the strongest person I know. This baby is coming, and you're going to be the most wonderful mother this territory has ever seen. Something in his unwavering confidence gave her renewed strength. When Mrs. Benson returned and announced it was time to push, Grace found reserves of energy she didn't know she possessed. At sunset, on June 27, 1876, her daughter entered the world with a lusty cry that filled the small cabin. Mrs. Benson cleaned and swaddled the infant before placing her in Grace's arms. She's perfect, Grace whispered, counting tiny fingers and toes, marveling at the delicate features and wisp of dark hair. When Rusty was finally allowed back in, his eyes filled with tears at the sight of Grace holding the baby. He approached the bed slowly, almost reverently. Would you like to hold your daughter? Grace asked softly, his head jerked up, eyes wide. My daughter, Grace nodded, her heart full to bursting. If you'll have her. With trembling hands, Rusty accepted the tiny bundle. The baby quieted immediately in his arms as if recognizing a safe haven. The look of wonder on his face as he gazed down at the infant told Grace everything she needed to know about the man she'd chosen. Hello, little one, he whispered. I'm your pa, and I'm going to love you every day of your life. Looking up at Grace, tears shining in his eyes, he asked, what shall we name her? Grace had been considering names for months but had never quite settled on one. Now, watching Rusty cradle her daughter with such tenderness, she knew. "Hope," she said. "Her name is Hope." Rusty nodded, a smile spreading across his face. "Hope Daniels, it's perfect." "Daniels?" Grace questioned. Rusty carefully placed Hope back in Grace's arms, then reached into his pocket. He withdrew a small, worn velvet box. "I've been carrying this for weeks, waiting for the right moment," he said, opening the box to reveal a simple gold band set with a small pearl. "It was my mother's. She gave it to me before she passed, said to save it for the woman who captured my heart." He took a deep breath. "Grace Dawson, I know our beginning wasn't conventional, but I love you with everything I am. I love this little girl as if she were my own flesh and blood. Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Grace looked from the ring to Rusty's earnest face to the tiny baby in her arms. From the moment Pastor Fleming had blocked her from entering the church, her life had taken an unexpected turn, leading her not to further shame and isolation, but to love, acceptance, and now family. "Yes," she whispered, tears of joy streaming down her cheeks. "Yes, I'll marry you, Rusty Daniels." As he slipped the ring onto her finger and sealed their promise with a tender kiss, Grace felt the final pieces of her heart healing. Here, with Rusty and Hope, she had found her home. They were married 2 weeks later in a simple ceremony performed by Judge Harrison on the porch of their cabin. Mrs. Holloway stood as Grace's witness, while Rusty's foreman, Frank, stood for him. Hope slept peacefully in Mrs. Holloway's arms throughout the brief service, unaware that her family was being officially formed around her. The wedding might have been small, but the celebration afterward was anything but. Word had spread throughout the area, and despite the circumstances of Hope's birth, many from town came to offer congratulations and welcome the new family. Even Pastor Fleming's wife arrived with a gift, a beautiful quilt she'd made herself, though the pastor himself remained conspicuously absent. As the summer turned to fall, the little family settled into a rhythm of their own. Rusty proved to be a natural father, often carrying Hope in a sling across his chest as he went about his ranch chores. The sight of the tall, rugged rancher tenderly talking to the tiny infant as he checked fences or fed livestock became a familiar one at the Double R. Grace continued working part-time at the milliner's shop, bringing Hope with her. Mrs. Holloway doted on the baby, and gradually, the townsfolk who had once shunned Grace began to warm to her. Some apologized outright for their earlier behavior. Others simply began treating her normally, inviting her to social gatherings and church functions. "It's as if they've forgotten they ever judged me," Grace commented to Rusty one evening as they sat on their porch, watching the sunset. Hope was asleep in her cradle inside, the window open so they could hear her if she woke. Rusty took Grace's hand, his thumb rubbing over her wedding band. "People can surprise you, some for the worse but many for the better if given the chance." "You surprised me," Grace said softly. "That day at the church when you offered your arm, I never expected anyone to stand up for me like that." "Best decision I ever made," Rusty replied, bringing her hand to his lips. "Walking beside you that day led me to everything I didn't know I needed." As winter approached, Rusty expanded the cabin, adding another bedroom and enlarging the main living area. "For the future," he explained when Grace questioned the need, "this family's just getting started." On Christmas Eve, with snow falling gently outside and a fire crackling in the hearth, they celebrated Hope's first Christmas. At 6 months old, she was a happy, healthy baby with her mother's blue eyes and a smile that could melt the hardest heart. After Hope was asleep in her cradle, Grace and Rusty exchanged their own gifts. Grace had made Rusty a new shirt, finer than any he'd owned before, with careful stitching and mother-of-pearl buttons. "It's beautiful," he said, running his fingers over the fabric. "Too nice for ranch work." "For Sundays," Grace explained, "and special occasions." Rusty's gift to Grace was a leather-bound journal. "I know you like to write sometimes," he said. "Thought you might want to keep track of Hope's growing up, or maybe write those stories you're always making up for her." Grace was touched by his thoughtfulness. "It's perfect, thank you." She hesitated, then added, "I have one more gift for you, but it won't arrive until summer." Rusty looked confused. "What do you mean?" Grace took his hand and placed it on her stomach. "Hope's going to be a big sister." The joy that spread across Rusty's face was everything Grace had hoped for. He gathered her in his arms, laughing and crying at once. Another baby, are you sure? Grace nodded, her own eyes shining with happy tears. Mrs. Benson confirmed it yesterday, due in July. Rusty placed a reverent kiss on her still flat stomach. Hello in there, little one, your pa can't wait to meet you. His use of pa so natural, so unqualified filled Grace with warmth. For Rusty, there was no distinction between Hope and this new child. They were both his, completely and without reservation. When Robert Daniels was born on a sweltering July afternoon in 1877, his arrival was markedly different from his sister's. This time, Rusty paced nervously outside with 13-month-old Hope in his arms, telling her stories to distract them both from the sounds coming from within the cabin. When Mrs. Benson finally called him in, he found Grace sitting up in bed, tired but radiant, holding a red-faced, squalling infant. "Meet your son," she said, her voice filled with pride and love. Rusty settled Hope carefully beside Grace on the bed, then accepted his newborn son with hands that had grown confident in handling small babies. "Hello, Robert," he whispered, using the name they'd chosen to honor Rusty's father. "Welcome to the family." Hope peered curiously at her new brother, then patted his tiny hand. "Baby," she said, clearly one of her few words so far. "That's right, sweetheart," Grace said, drawing her daughter close. "Your baby brother." As the years passed, the Daniels family thrived. The Double R Ranch prospered under Rusty's careful management, growing to become one of the most successful operations in the territory. Grace eventually opened a small dressmaking business in town, her skilled work much in demand for everything from everyday dresses to wedding gowns. Hope and Robert were joined by two more siblings, Elizabeth in 1879 and William in 1882. The Daniels children grew up knowing the value of hard work, the importance of kindness, and the strength that comes from family standing together. When Hope was 7, she came home from school one day in tears. Grace found her in the barn, hiding in an empty stall. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" Grace asked, sitting beside her daughter on the hay. "Tommy Wilson said you're not really married to Pa," Hope sobbed. "He said I don't belong to Pa 'cause I have a different last name from before." Grace's heart clenched. They had always planned to tell the children the truth when they were old enough to understand, but not like this, not as a weapon wielded by a thoughtless classmate. That evening, after the younger children were asleep, Grace and Rusty sat Hope down in front of the fireplace. "Your ma and I have something important to tell you," Rusty began, his voice gentle but serious. They explained in simple terms appropriate for a 7-year-old how Grace had come to Willow Creek carrying Hope in her belly, how Rusty had stood up for her at the church, and how they had fallen in love before Hope was born. "So Pa isn't my real father?" Hope asked, her lower lip trembling. "That's not what we're saying at all," Rusty said firmly. He lifted Hope onto his lap, though she was getting almost too big for such treatment. "The man whose seed helped create you, he's not your father. He never was. A father is the man who loves you, who teaches you to ride and read and be brave. A father is the one who's there when you're sick or scared or happy." He cupped her face in his weathered hands. "I have been your father since before you took your first breath, Hope Daniels. Nothing and no one will ever change that, not ever." Hope studied his face for a long moment, then threw her arms around his neck. "I love you, Pa." "I love you too, Hopi," he whispered, using his special nickname for her, "more than you'll ever know." The incident led to a conversation with the school teacher and Tommy Wilson's parents, resulting in an apology to Hope and a valuable lesson for the entire class about the true meaning of family. As the children grew, the story of how their parents met became a favorite bedtime request, though the version they heard was carefully edited for young ears. It became something of a family legend, the tale of the cowboy who offered his arm to a woman in need and found his heart's desire in the process. On their 10th wedding anniversary in 1886, Grace and Rusty returned to Willow Creek Church for a special service. Pastor Fleming had long since moved on, replaced by a younger, more compassionate minister who had welcomed the Daniels family warmly from his first Sunday. After the service, they walked to the steps where they had first truly met. The church had been repainted, the steps rebuilt, but the spot remained significant to them both. 10 years, Grace mused, looking up at the church door that had once been closed to her. Sometimes it feels like yesterday that I stood here, terrified and alone." Rusty took her hand, bringing it to his lips in a gesture that had become familiar over their years together. "You were never alone again after that day." "No," she agreed, leaning into his embrace. "Never alone, never unwanted, never unloved." That evening, with the children staying overnight at Mrs. Holloway's house in town, Rusty and Grace had a rare night to themselves. They sat on the porch of their home, no longer the small cabin, but a comfortable house they had built as their family grew, watching the stars emerge in the Wyoming sky. "Any regrets?" Rusty asked, his arm around her shoulders. Grace considered the question seriously. Her life had taken such an unexpected turn from what she had once planned, yet looking back, she wouldn't change a thing. "Not one," she answered truthfully. "Every step of the journey, even the painful ones, led me here, to you, to our children, to this life we've built together." Rusty nodded, understanding completely. "When I offered you my arm that day, I was just doing what seemed right. I had no idea I was walking toward my own happiness." Grace leaned up to kiss him, still moved by the simple goodness of the man she had married. A lot of men would have walked past. Or worse, joined in the judgment. "I'm not a lot of men," Rusty said with a wink. "No," Grace agreed, resting her head on his shoulder as they gazed at the star-filled sky. "You're the man who saw me when no one else would look, the man who gave me back my dignity and then my heart. The father of my children, all of them." Rusty tightened his arm around her. "And you're the woman who showed me what true courage looks like, who made me a father and made this ranch a home." As they sat together in the peaceful night, Grace reflected on the journey that had brought them here. From shame and rejection to love and acceptance. From a pregnant woman shunned at a church door to the matriarch of a thriving family. From a lonely rancher to a devoted husband and father. "I think," she said softly, "that sometimes the best journeys start with a simple act of kindness." Rusty nodded, his eyes reflecting the starlight. "And sometimes, offering your arm to someone in need leads you right where you're meant to be." Together they watched as a shooting star streaked across the Wyoming sky, a bright promise in the vast darkness, much like the hope they had found in each other on the steps of a church. 10 years ago to the day.